Hurricanes present a variety of threats and should be taken seriously. Storm surge is the abnormal rising seawater level during a storm and can cause extensive flooding and damage. High winds produced by a hurricane can be powerful enough to blow a house away. Inland flooding from freshwater rain poses a serious threat not just along the coast. Hurricanes can also cause outbreaks of tornadoes. Preparedness is the best way to protect you and your family this hurricane season. Make a plan, build a kit, and stay informed.
We appreciate I-45 Now and TJ Alls for covering this event. There is also a crew here from KHEA Radio. We are recording this event, and community will be able to view today's program later online on I-45 Now and on the Chamber's Facebook page. Now I'd like to call to the podium our first speaker, Scott Dufouri, Emergency Management Coordinator for the Galveston County. Scott has been working for the county for almost 4 years, and prior to that was at the Port of Freeport and the U.S. Coast Guard. He will bring us some advice to prepare for the season. Welcome, Scott.
Good afternoon, and thank you, everyone. So as we go into hurricane season, one of the big initiatives my office has really tried to push this year is bringing the businesses into it. Businesses are such a critical part of our community. So we have a new initiative with the Business Task Force that we've been working with for a couple weeks now on providing preparedness material for businesses, your employees. And we look at it as a 5 areas of surviving disasters for businesses: adequate insurance, employee protection, property preservation, business continuity, and disaster recovery. We are also be shooting our video tomorrow with the chambers and some of the businesses in the county. So hopefully we'll have that out too in a few weeks. But we're really trying to drive businesses to this initiative, which we're calling We're Ready, Are You? So as businesses, reaching out to your chambers and being able to get the packet of information and kind of going through the different preparednesses for all disasters. A lot of times we focus on hurricane season, but we really have to look at all disaster preparedness. And a lot of those disasters or supplies you would use for hurricane season go into a lot of other areas, winter storms, power outages. So a lot of those supplies are similar. So we're really trying to connect with our businesses. My office hosts a lot of classes, everything from weather-related, lost person behavior, active threats. Please reach out to my office at any time. We'll be more than happy to come and talk to your organization and help you and your staff prepare for hurricane season or any other types of disasters. But the biggest part we'll hear from our other speakers is the preparedness, having a plan, build a kit, and stay informed, and listen to your local officials, your trusted news sources, to get the most accurate and updated information that we could share with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for this great information. We appreciate your work on behalf of the entire county. Now I'd like to invite to the podium the new city manager at the city of Marque, Cesar Garcia, who will introduce our first speaker. Cesar has been in place for just a few months, and we're honored to have him with us today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed the great meal. I'm honored to be here before you to introduce a very important member of our team, Mr. Kyle Hunter. He's 38 years young, born and raised here in Galveston County, graduated right down the street at Hitchcock High School, attended College of Mainland, completed his advanced professional series in emergency management in 2018. As he says it, he started off in 2002 helping with IT stuff, which slowly emerged into emergency management, and later on helping with facilities. He's a backbone of our city, and I'm proud to have him on our team. He started working as an actual contract employee in 2004 and is currently one of the longest tenured city employees that we have in the city of Marque. He's married, got 5 children, and does what he does as a true public servant, as an example for our city. And I'm honored to have him as our emergency management coordinator. No further ado, Mr. Kyle Hunter.
Good afternoon. As an EMC myself and every other EMC, we spend most of the time planning, reviewing, and updating our plans for all types of hazards. However, emergency management seems to keep taking on more and more the longer I'm in it. I mean, I remember meeting with Bruce and George and my boss at the time to discuss fuel, food, and whether or not we was going to call for a mandatory evacuation. We all had to deal with, now over the years, we all had to deal with not only storms and floods, but national pandemics, which changed how everybody did business. We're dealing with a supply chain issue. We've dealt with 20-degree weather, which we all know Texas wasn't made for. And now, it seems like cyber attacks is the newest thing. Cyber attacks is one that I never thought would be in emergency management. But it seems to be a hot topic at the Needham conference this year. I talked to multiple jurisdictions who had catastrophic attacks that stopped the day-to-day operations. Because when you have staff that can't access files, you have citizens that can't pay a water bill, you yourself can't pay your staff or your vendors, that becomes a huge problem. So now, EMCs have to insert a new annex in our plan for cyber attacks. That's how we handle them. And then for all that, let's talk about the reason we're here today, storm season. As you can see, this year is predicted to be an above normal year. However, you will be hearing all about that, hopefully from one of our speakers who's more educated in that section than I am. Not a weather guy, IT guy, EMC. I can do that. But one thing I do want to remind everybody is to have a plan. Because without a plan, then when something hits the coast, you're going to be distracted, you're going to be worried, you're going to miss stuff. And especially for our first responders or anybody that has to report back to work during an event, you can ask any EMC. We would rather have an employee that had a plan, that is not distracted and not worried about their family, because their families, they had a plan. Their family's gone. Their family's got the supplies and at grandma's house or whatever. So please, please, look at your plan internally in your house and know what you plan on doing. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite to the stage Mayor Dedrick Johnson from the City of Texas City to introduce our second speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to introduce to you Mr. Joe Tumbleton, our Emergency Management Coordinator with the City of Texas City. Joe was hired on with the City of Texas City Fire Department in 1996 and recently retired from the fire department as battalion chief. During that time, he obtained several certifications: his Master Firefighter certification, State Hazmat certification, Paramedic certification, and he graduated from the Texas Fire Chiefs Academy. He's Associate of Science in Fire Science, Fire Officer 2 State certification, Fire Instructor 2 State certification, and he has numerous other certifications such as National Incident Management System, Pipeline, Hazmat, Rail, Criminal Justice, Radiation and Hazmat Response, and several others. Joe has worked during his days off responding to emergency hazmat situations and incidents, performing safety and air monitoring. He's worked through industrial incidents and several major storms in the City of Texas City during and throughout his career. He's worked with numerous state and federal agencies during this event. Lately, he's been paired up with our former emergency management coordinator, teaching Bruce Clausen things on his way out. And we're very happy that was a joke. Y'all supposed to laugh at that, but anyway. We're very happy that Joe is a part of our team. Joe Tumbleton, we just call him Joe T. I want to welcome him to the stage. Y'all help me with that.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Paige, for inviting me and allowing me to introduce myself to everyone. As Mayor said, I started here in 1996. I was fortunate enough to be hired on with the fire department. And I got to help people and be a part of something that was bigger than myself. I had an incredible career, worked with some amazing people, and had some great memories. Then at the beginning of this year, Mayor Johnson offered me the position of emergency manager and Homeland Security Director, so I went home and talked with my wife about it, and she said I didn't have a choice, I had to take it. So here I am. I'm enjoying it. I'm loving every minute of it. I am married. I met my wife here on an emergency call 25 years ago. She was a paramedic on one of the local ambulances, and 26 years later, we have 3 teenagers in the house that keep us pretty busy. So I just wanted to hit on a couple unique items concerning this hurricane season here in this area. If we talk about our levee system. Oh, I'm sorry, we can go back one slide. Kyle said it best, having a plan is the most important thing, right? You got to have a plan, and there's a lot of information on the back tables. Feel free to get on your way out. There's a lot of information on your tables that you're sitting at that'll help you work through a plan. This www.weather.gov/Houston is the National Weather Service website, and at the very top there's a link to their 2022 Hurricane Severe Weather Guide. And it's a very informative guide, well done, and it'll walk you through making a plan. I read through it, and there was stuff I didn't think about in there, you know. So it'll walk you through your risk and your insurance, hardening your house, checking on your neighbors, your evacuation plan. You know, it's kind of unique this year with all the construction we have, so it's good to use a guide like this to help you walk through making a plan in stages and making sure you're checking every box and not just missing something that you don't think about till the last minute. So highly recommend that one. There's also some good ones. Scott with Emergency Management in the county has a great one back there on the table as well. Feel free to grab any of this stuff to use as a resource when making your plan. So I wanted to talk about our levee system here in Texas City. The levee system was started in 1961 and finished in 1987, and it cost approximately $56 million at the time. Today's money, that's about $545 million. It's a critical part of our infrastructure right here. It protects our $7 billion refining industry. So the levee, you can go to the next slide. The levee's 17 miles long, and it's situated 19 to 23 feet above sea level. So it gives us a lot of protection. It's designed to protect against a 15-foot storm surge with 8-foot waves. So that's equivalent to a large Category 3 or small Category 4 storm. But we don't want to take too much into that correlation because there can be Category 3 storms with a greater storm surge than a Category 4. So here in the city, we're going to watch both. We subscribe to multiple weather sources, and we monitor them constantly. If there's any prediction of a storm moving into the Gulf, we start having regular conference calls with the State Department of Emergency Management and the National Weather Service, and we'll disseminate that information as we get it. As the storm gets closer, we'll start meeting in those calls every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, just to make sure we get all the best information we can to make informed decisions. So just know whenever a storm's coming, pay attention to your trusted news outlets. And we can go to the next slide. The way we send out our information here in Texas City is we use a system called Everbridge. You can sign up to get these emergency alerts. Probably most of you in the room do have them already, but if you don't, you can go to www.mytcalerts.com, fill in some information, and you'll be added to our contact list. Currently, when we send out a message, we send it out to about 45,000 people when we send that message out. We also have the ability to use a federal system called iPause in an emergency through this Everbridge system, to where even if you're not signed up, if you have a cell phone on in the area that we designate, it's going to hit your cell phone like a Amber Alert or severe weather alert. So we'll use that system as well to get information out. And you can also sign up for these alerts by going to the City of Texas City website at texascitytx.gov. And if you hadn't been to that site, that's a great site. It has a lot of information on it. That's another way we send out information is at the bottom of that website page. We'll have a happening now on there. Everything that's happening now in Texas City will be on there. And any important messages that we need to disseminate through emergency management, we'll do it through, if it's an emergency, through this Everbridge system. But if it's not an emergency but an important message, we may use the city website. And you can go to the next page. Texas City Emergency Management also has a Facebook page. You can get to it by facebook.com/TexasCityEM. So on this page, we'll send out important but non-emergency updates. We send out yesterday an advisory on the heat, which I'm sure everybody knows just by walking outside, it's pretty hot, right? But we'll post that stuff on there, some tips on how to stay safe and stay hydrated. And then the city of Texas City also has a Facebook page that they'll also share some of their important information on. So these are just some of the other ways to make sure you're staying informed and getting the latest information on the information that we're getting through the EOC. So, and also we'll use the local media outlets, I-45 channel, all the local channels in Houston. If it's an emergency or a disaster, they'll be contacting us or we'll be contacting them. We'll also use them to help disseminate information throughout the public. So storm surge is the major problem, major issue with hurricanes. You want to not drown, right? So you want to get off the coast. That weather, National Weather Service page that I mentioned, to look up that severe weather guide, that has some great information on storm surge areas. They have in there a couple maps with some predictions on a Category 1, a Category 3, a Category 5, what that storm surge would look like. So know what area you're in and have a plan beforehand. Here in Texas City, we're kind of unique with the levee system, so stay tuned to local media and make a decision on that. So again, to reiterate what Kyle said, and I think the point of this whole hurricane season is to have a plan. Know where you're going. You just want to go far enough north to get away from that storm surge, right? If you have a nice bed and breakfast that you stayed at a year ago or a nice hotel that you like, go ahead and put that in your plan and make sure it's available. And then know when you're leaving, right? We're talking about the construction. I would definitely leave earlier than I would have left 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know how many here were here in Rita, but that was a nightmare, right? Leaving at the last minute. It's going to be worse this year with, I think, the population increased and the traffic lanes lessened. It doesn't hurt to leave 3 or 4 days early, and if the storm takes a turn, right, you just have a nice little vacation, right? You had a really good excuse for leaving. So plan on leaving early, and make a list of what you're taking. So I like to put that quote up there. A goal without a plan is just a wish. So we do have some handouts in the back table. Help yourself to those handouts on the way out. And that's all I have. I'll just leave it on that slide there if anybody wants to take that note and use that resource to help make your plan. All right. Thank you for having me.
And now our keynote speaker is Dr. Hal Needham. Dr. Hal Needham has over 15 years experience conducting risk analysis for disaster-prone communities. He utilizes cutting-edge methods. He works hard to calculate the risks to coastal buildings and infrastructure. He has innovated geospatial mapping techniques and will talk to us about that technology. He directs the U-Surge project, which provides flood data for coastal communities from Texas to Maine. Dr. Needham has degrees from Penn State University and Louisiana State University, and he lives in Galveston. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Hurricane Hal.
Thank you, Ron, for the warm introduction. So nice to see so many of you, some familiar faces, some new faces. My name is Dr. Hal Needham. Some people call me Hurricane Hal. I live over there in Galveston. I'm having a really unusual week. I landed in Washington, D.C. at 2 o'clock in the morning on Sunday night. And as I'm taking my Uber across Washington, I'm like, people say the traffic's terrible here. I don't see it. So I got to the hotel at like 2:30 on Sunday night. And then this morning, I set my alarm for 2:30 in the morning again, and I left the hotel at 2:45 to get back to Dallas. And again, there's nobody on the roads at 3 in the morning. So if you need to go to D.C., go travel around 2:33 in the morning, you'll do fine. I'll tell you, the more time I spend in D.C., the happier I am to get back to Texas, though. It's a great place. I've lived in South Louisiana for 8 years, and I here in the Texas coast about 6 years, and it really feels like home. I love being here, and as I travel the country too, I'm amazed to see how many people don't realize how vital the industry that we have here is, not just for our own cities, but our county, our state, and the nation. I mean, people don't realize the work that we do here fuels everything around the country. So I thank you for all that you do here in Texas City. I'm an extreme weather and disaster scientist. I've been obsessed with weather since I'm about 4 years old. So I live over in Galveston. If you don't know the history, you can go fairly quickly through these slides here. I live in Galveston. If you probably know the history, but Galveston was actually the second wealthiest city per capita in the U.S. in the late 1800s. It was a very wealthy port that was doing a lot of trading. Of course, we know the history. On September 8th, 1900, this next picture shows what happened in Galveston. A 16-foot storm surge washed across the island, killing between probably 6,000 to 8,000 people died on the island, even more when you include the mainland. and still the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Unfortunately, these storm surges, these massive saltwater floods, they're not just something of the past. We still see them in the present as well. And these next couple of slides are just, for 14 years, I've been actually going into hurricane zones. I'll try to be on the ground before, during, and after. I learn a lot just from being on the ground. These are pictures here from Mexico Beach, Florida, where a Category 5 hurricane struck 4 years ago, Hurricane Michael. And there were, beachfront mansions there the day before, and they're just completely gone without a trace. This next picture is really powerful. This is a before and after picture. The upper picture, the Weather Channel's on. I have my laptop out. It's 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm making a storm chase plan in El Governor Hotel. The bottom picture, my feet are in the same place about 3 days later. And you can just see the storm surge came in there and just completely gutted everything. So that's the power of water. What is storm surge and why is it so powerful? This kind of shows you when you have strong onshore winds, the entire column of water raises. When people think about floods, they often picture water coming up vertically, but this next slide shows in a hurricane storm surge, the water's moving in like a raging river, and that's why the impact on our infrastructure, our roads, our buildings is catastrophic. It's the world's deadliest and costliest natural disaster. So I moved to the Gulf Coast in 2008, right before Hurricanes Gustav and Ike, and I couldn't believe when I started grad school at Louisiana State University, there was no storm surge database. So I thought, how can this be? This is the deadliest, costliest natural disaster, and there's no database. I quickly began to see there were storm surge data everywhere. So we have tide gauge data going back as far as 1904. The top middle, we have Hurricane Center reports back to 1958. They tell you what the storm surge level was. The top right picture there, that's a U.S. Army Corps map from 1915. Those maps start around 1886. Again, way back in the 1880s, we didn't have internet or smartphones, but we had pencils and paper and rulers and actually went out there and measured how high the water got. The bottom right are newspapers. Just in my master's degree, I read through like 3,000 pages of historical newspapers. We have high water marks, the bottom center, all over the Gulf and the Atlantic coast, and then photographs. The bottom left there, that's a picture of Miami, Florida in 1926. And you can see the tops of palm trees sticking out. Miami hasn't been hit. They've been very lucky for a long time, but since then they have, this population explosion, and we see the pictures where you see the top sticking out of the water, and that tells us something about the vulnerability. So, I started looking into these data sources and I began to see, there were plenty of observations to actually make a storm surge database, but I thought, if this goes big, we need to make this into like a good acronym. So I kept coming back to the concept of calling this water height observation data. The problem is when you make that into an acronym, pretty much the only way you can do it is to call it HUDAT, which was the battle cry for the New Orleans Saints. So at the time I was living in South Louisiana, I thought, we need to call this the HUDAT database because the people funding this, they're from up in Washington, D.C. They've never heard of HUDAT before. So we can, in our annual report, we can put pictures like this, and they'll be like, we don't know what they're doing down there on the Gulf Coast, but people love this. I mean, there's like thousands of people in the street that love this water height observation data, so we'll just keep funding it. That was kind of like my long-term plan. Just use the HUDAT slogan, and we'll keep getting funded forever. I was kind of overruled. We didn't call it HUDAT. The first version we called SurgeAT, and now we call it USurge. And what we did in a snapshot here, this is really a climatology of coastal flood events back to 1880. So every dot on that map is the location and the height of the peak storm surge. And you can see the red dots are storm surge more than 13 feet. The purple dots are more than 16 and a half feet. And you can see there's a geography or a pattern to this. Look really from around Panama City, Florida, west along the coast of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. You see a lot of red and purple dots, and you see a bunch in the Florida Keys, but look at the west coast of Florida. We don't see any of those near Tampa. It doesn't mean that they couldn't get a 20-foot storm surge in Tampa, but there's a geography to this. There's a reason why we see these patterns. Part of it has to do with how shallow the water is offshore. Places like here on the upper Texas coast, Louisiana, Mississippi, we have really shallow water offshore. That actually enhances the storm surge levels. And so there's a pattern to this. And if you know that pattern, you can help yourself from being blindsided. One of the limitations of this map, every storm is just one dot. But this next map shows you, for example, I started going storm by storm and mapping all the high water marks for all the storms. It took a lot of time, but this, for example, is Katrina. I mean, everything in black there is more than 16 feet of storm surge. The entire Mississippi coast just got hammered there by Katrina in 2005. once we actually build out all those layers, we could overlay them and start to look into communities and understand their flood history. And that's what we're going to talk about next here. So I think this next one gets into, so USurge, you can just check that out online. This is really the first comprehensive flood history for 26 Gulf Coast cities and about 18 Atlantic seaboard cities as well, so people can know their history. And this next slide kind of gets into, this is interesting. So this is Pensacola, Florida. So this is from 1890 to present. Every high water mark there is a flood event. And you can see that there are 3 events that are a lot higher than the others. So, we have 3 events between 9 and 10 feet. Ivan in 2004, there was a storm in 1926 and a storm in 1906. So if you were making regulations, or if you had to tell people how high to build, how high would you tell? You'd probably say that you want it to be higher than those 3 big events. But when we look at FEMA's base flood elevation, it's much lower than those 3 big events. And so we see this in a lot of communities. The base flood elevation that we see is not gospel. And a lot of times it does not align very well with the observed data. And what's interesting is when we think about how people, the psychology of flood risk, and thinking back to this next slide shows, imagine that you lived in Pensacola since 1960. So you're like, I've been here for 62 years. All of a sudden, that 7-foot base flood elevation doesn't look that unreasonable. You're like, every flood since 1960 was lower than the BFE, except for Ivan, but that must have been like a million-year storm. I mean, it was an outlier. There was nothing like that. But when we look back farther in time to 1926 and 1906, all of a sudden that Ivan dot in the top right, it doesn't look so exceptional anymore. In fact, it's probably like a 30 or 40-year storm. Looking back farther into the early 1900s, late 1800s, that can help us from being blindsided. And what we see a lot is sometimes we get a flood level, the same level from 100 years ago, and people want to call it climate change. We've never seen this before. It happened in history, you just didn't know your history. And so building these deeper histories can really help communities from being blindsided. We understand what's happened before, and that can be a good baseline moving forward. These next graphics kind of get into talking about not only do we have the flood history, we do a lot of first floor elevation mapping. So we map out the elevations of roads, of buildings. This is a 2-year project we just did in Biloxi, Mississippi. And we actually went in, and we can go quickly through these next slides. In like a lot of coastal communities, you get to Biloxi, Mississippi, some of the buildings are elevated, some of them are slab on grade, right on the ground. So even if we knew that there's going to be a 4-foot flood, how many buildings would flood? Most communities have no idea. And so we took elevation certificates like this one. The next slide shows GPS instruments that we went out on the street. And the next slide shows Google Street View. So we did street level imagery. And we actually mapped out all the building elevations for about 1,300 buildings in Biloxi. And this is the elevation map. So that's not your ground elevation, that's actually your building elevation. And we saw quite a variation depending on where you live. And what we could do is we could compare those building elevations to FEMA's base flood elevation. And this next map shows you everything in blue there is in FEMA's flood zone, and those buildings are all elevated lower than the base flood elevation. So new construction, you have to build to 17 feet in Biloxi. But in these historic coastal communities, a lot of these older buildings have been grandfathered in. 73% of the buildings are lower than FEMA's base flood elevation. Everything in yellow there, it's also in the flood zone, but elevated higher than the base flood elevation. And everything in orange is not in the flood zone. But another way to look at this, imagine that a 17-foot saltwater storm surge is moving into Biloxi. We could talk to the emergency management or the city code officials or planning department and say, hey, that map that we just showed you, everything in blue we think is going to flood. We could actually do building by building flood forecasting. And we've been doing that in places like Galveston, Biloxi. This is really expanding along the coast. We've also been doing what we call community flood monitoring system. This is incredibly low tech. So I'm a low tech guy, so I like this kind of project. I go out there with PVC pipes and some Hobby Lobby tape measures, and I have 2 poles that I put in people's yard. All you need is if you have an elevation certificate for your home and you'll let us put a flood monitoring system, we'll come out and we'll do that. This next slide shows you how so the pole on the right, the bottom of the pole is at 0. The pole on the left is calibrated to the tide gauge. And so at this house, if there was 6 inches of water above the ground, it would read about 92 inches. And so the beauty of that, if your neighbor evacuated to Dallas and they're wondering, I wonder if I flooded or not, we could say, well, your elevation certificate said your first floor is at 98 inches, so no, you didn't flood. Even though you're not home, we know that. And this next map shows that what we're able to do is actually create real-time flood mapping in the urban environment. This is a couple, Jim and Pat Egler. They're down in Sea Isle, Texas. They're what we call citizen scientists. They're a cute couple. They have one of those flood monitors on their bulkhead that I put in. So they had an elevation certificate. They were going to stay for a storm. So they're sending pictures every 3 hours during tropical storm beta. And again, the one on the right, AGL, it's above ground level. The one on the left is just calibrated to the tide gauge. And so these are pictures I was getting from them. You know, they sent me a picture at 3 p.m., 6 p.m., 9 p.m. At midnight, my phone vibrates. Who's this? Oh, they're sending me a picture. 3 in the morning. I said, get some sleep. It was their 47th wedding anniversary. They said, no, this is so exciting. We love doing this. So they were in an elevated home. This wasn't a Cat 3 hurricane. They were going to stay, and they were just sending me photos. And then we could create maps like this in real time. That's a map of their community. Everything in yellow and green is dry. Everything in blue is wet. But we could share this with community members that stayed and community members that evacuated. We could get a pretty good idea in real time what's flooded. And again, you couldn't do that just using the tide gauges because Galveston has tide gauges. We have some tide gauges down in San Luis Pass, but this area is over by Jamaica Beach. There's no tide gauges. Well, we created our own tide gauge basically in the urban environment. So some pretty cool stuff, and again, it uses citizen scientists. So people that want to be involved, we've had overwhelming response. A lot of people said, hey, you can put one of those at our house. So moving forward, let's go to this next. We'll talk about the hurricane outlook for this season. Last year, we had 21 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes. So the average would be 14, 7, and 3. So last year was the third most active season as far as named storms in the Atlantic Basin. The year before was the most active. 2 years ago, we had 30 named storms. So what's going on? We're having some very active seasons. We'll talk a little bit about that and about the forecast here in these next slides. So this is the map from last year. Obviously, very busy season. A lot of those storms were actually off the coast. The big impacts were obviously Hurricane Ida in southeast Louisiana that made landfall as a Cat 4, and then Hurricane Nicholas made landfall just south of Freeport. We had some tropical storm force winds and some heavy rain and some minor storm surge here in the upper Texas coast, but nothing too severe. So again, we'll be tracking this year and see what happens, but the last several years have been very, very active. These next slides will get into talking about the seasonal forecast. I was just at the National Tropical Weather Conference in April in South Padre Island. So when you hear about these seasonal forecasts and predicting how many storms, one of the leaders for that is a guy named Phil Klossbach out of Colorado State University. We were just hanging out down there in South Padre. This is Phil, and I took a picture of the slide that he put up on this next slide. And actually, we can go one more, and that shows the forecast from Colorado State. They were forecasting 19 named storms this year, 9 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes. So again, we're looking at active season. So a lot of people have asked me just in the last week, how do they come up with this? Do they have a crystal ball? How can they know how many storms are forecast during the season? And these next slides will talk about that a little bit. It's really all about the sea surface temperatures. And so where you see yellow, orange, and red, the water is running warmer than normal. And so we see a lot of those colors in the Gulf, Caribbean, and the main development region in the Atlantic. Incidentally, the Atlantic tends to stay warm or cold in a phase that tends to last from 2 to 4 decades. So the Atlantic, if you've noticed, it's been warm since 1995. Before that, it was cold from 1970 to 1994. We can't think of a lot of really busy hurricane seasons from the 70s and 80s because the Atlantic was running cold. That's not necessarily a climate change thing. That's just a cycle that happens over time. And also, this next slide looks at the equatorial Pacific. I put a box out there. When the Pacific is running cold, we call that La Nina. And when the Atlantic is running warm, again, the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, that combination is usually when we see these hyperactive seasons. So that's really the gist of why they're predicting so many storms this year. Where are these storms going to go? That's something that I start forecasting around mid-June, probably in a week or two. I'll do that forecast. I'm almost more interested in where the storms track than how many storms there are. I don't care if there's 94 storms, if they're all out east of Bermuda, who cares, right? So I'll be talking about that a lot in the upcoming weeks. There are some indications that you can get an idea if they're going to track more west or more east. And again, we hope that they can stay east and stay out to sea. These next maps, this shows the frequency of the number of hurricanes per 100 years. This is kind of interesting. You can see that this runs from May 10th through December. You can see really the hurricane season officially runs from June 1st until the end of November, but really the heart of hurricane season for tropical storms and hurricanes is from August, September, and the first half of October. And that's really when we've historically seen the big impacts around here. But we know in this part of the country, not only named storms, I mean, we've had a lot of big flood events sometimes in April and May in the Houston metro area all the way down to the coast. So we can get flooding and big events really any time of the year. We always have to be prepared. These next slides get into talking about some recent trends that we've seen. There are 2 trends that really concern me. And again, a lot of this is stuff I learned when I'm out there in the field every year. This first trend gets into rapidly intensifying hurricanes. This is a picture of Laplace, Louisiana, just west of New Orleans. I took this 2 days after Ida made landfall. It looked like a Hollywood movie set. I mean, this is 2 days after landfall. I rolled in, you think the storm just hit an hour before. There was a lot of destruction there west of New Orleans. This next picture shows some of the wind damage. This was tremendous damage here. And what hit me in this storm, we can just kind of go through these slides. A lot of damage it hit as a Cat 4 hurricane, a lot of storm surge, a lot of rain. There was flooding and wind damage. And this woman here I spoke to, and she was cleaning out her garage. She had a 30-inch high water mark in her garage, and the stairs to the attic were still pulled down. I started talking to her and her husband, and she said, we almost died in the storm. I said, what happened? The water started rushing into their house. They pulled down the attic stairs, ran up into the attic for refuge. If this is just a wind event, or just a rain event, not a big deal. But you saw some of these roofs were off the houses. This was, in her area, probably Cat 2 winds, and they're taking refuge in the attic. I said, so, why didn't you guys evacuate? She said, for one, we're not in FEMA's flood zone. We didn't think that we were at high risk. But secondly, we've had 5 rapidly intensifying hurricanes in the past 5 years. So I was driving around Metro New Orleans the day before a Cat 4 hurricane hit last year, and this is what I saw when I was driving around. This next slide, the emergency message sign said nothing about the Cat 4 hurricane coming in. It said seatbelts, vaccinations, both save lives. Nothing. They're not under mandatory evacuation. There's no evacuation messaging. Why didn't they? I lived in South Louisiana and did my first storm chase with LSU in 2008. Hurricane Gustav came in on the same track as this storm. You can see the Superdome there. I'm not making this up. This is in New Orleans last August. Seatbelts, vaccinations, both save lives. Cat 4 hurricane coming in. But what happened was this took a very similar track as Gustav in 2008. Gustav was a Cat 2, and they did contraflow. They evacuated New Orleans Metro for Cat 2. Last year for a Cat 4, they did not evacuate. The difference, they didn't have time. This just exploded off the coast. And so we sometimes have in our head this luxury that we're going to have 72 hours or 96 hours to prepare. Again, we've had 5 storms in the last 5 years rapidly intensify. And this is a map, I think, of these storms. You can see Ida there is in the central part of it. That intensified by 55 miles an hour in the 24 hours before landfall. The other ones are Michael in 2018, intensified by 45 miles an hour. And then we have Laura, Harvey, and Hannah, all intensified by at least 40 miles an hour in that last 24 hours before landfall. So you're jumping up from like a Cat 1 to a Cat 4, or a tropical storm to a Cat 3. It's scary stuff because how do you prepare for that? How do you react so quickly when we have so many people? We have so many hospitals and facilities along the coast. This is a graphic showing a list of all the storms that have rapidly intensified in the 24 hours before landfall since 1950. It's happened 10 times in 71 years, but 5 in the past 5. So that's something, we think that the Gulf waters are warmer than they used to be, and this is a trend that concerns us, but especially for people that work with hospital facilities, large industrial facilities, or just, we need to talk and revisit our emergency preparedness plans, I think. For our facilities, for our people, for our communities, we need to be aware of this so that we're not blindsided. What do we do if we don't have that much time to get people out? These are things that we definitely need to be discussing. I'm really concerned about South Florida. I'm concerned about New Orleans Metro, and I'm concerned about the Galveston corridor. Those are the 3 areas. If you're in coastal Alabama, you can just kind of get up north pretty quick. If you're in South Texas, you can get inland quick. Here, we have this problem with the pinch point of Houston. There are complexities with it. And so it's something we just don't want to be blindsided by. The second trend that I wanted to talk about is, and that's a list of the storms that rapidly intensified between 1950 and 1999. So it happened once every 17 years. We've seen 5 in the last 5 years. So it's just good to be aware of these trends, and we just don't, it's not about fear-mongering, but we just don't want to be blindsided. That's my gist with that. This next slide talks about, so that's, intensification. Are we prepared for, getting out quickly? And a lot of this has to do with, being prepared, having our supplies that we don't have to run to the store if something forms in the Gulf. We already have it. We're already well prepared. The second trend, I think we're going to get into that. This is another statistic that's interesting. We've had 5 Cat 4 and 5 landfalls in the last 5 years. And in the previous 51 years, we also had 5. So that, again, it's just good to be aware, just based on the data, that we're seeing these trends of some strong storms making landfall and also some rapidly intensifying storms. The trend number 2 is really these stalled out or these slow-moving storms. Hurricane Harvey would be a good example of that. We have seen, I think, like 6 out of the last 7 seasons, we've seen these slow-moving or stalled-out systems. In 2015, there was a storm called Joaquin that just stalled over the Bahamas. There was 3 days of rainfall that just pushed into South Carolina. They got tremendous rainfall over by Columbia, South Carolina. 2016 was a hybrid system in South Louisiana. Over by Baton Rouge, they got 30 inches of rain. We know about Harvey, obviously, tremendous rainfall all the way up through the Houston corridor and over to Beaumont, Port Arthur. I mean, just some record-breaking nationally rainfall, as much as 40, 50, 60 inches of rain. And then 2018, we had Hurricane Florence that was over there, and these are all pictures I've taken. This was over in North Carolina. They had about 30 inches from an all-out hurricane. The category system just tells you your wind speed. It doesn't talk about, a lot of people say, oh, it's just a Cat 1, or you hear people say, oh, it's been downgraded from a Cat 1, so people think the risk is passed. Well, that doesn't matter when you're going to have 9 feet of water in your house, right? So the category system is something we need to be really careful about. A lot of this flooding happens with lower category storms or even a tropical storm that isn't a category. This is a picture of North Carolina, 2018, Tropical Storm Imelda, actually in the upper Texas coast and southeast Texas in 2019, and then Hurricane Sally in 2020. This is a picture I took over in Dauphin Island. That was making landfall. Again, it was just moving forward at like 2 miles an hour. So I just spent a lot of time. My parent company is based in South Louisiana, and they're like, to take Cat 2 winds, but to have a storm just moving through at 2 miles an hour, we're just getting pounded for 8-9 hours. So these slow-moving storms prolong the amount of wind stress, but they dump a lot more rain. And so that doesn't show up in the category number. And we saw that with Harvey, right? When most of the flooding happened for Houston Metro down through Galveston, Beaumont, Port Arthur, Harvey wasn't even a hurricane anymore, but it was dumping tremendous amounts of rainfall. So I did a special with PBS. I think that it gets into this here. It gets into some of these trends. The model suggests that we should see more stalled out storms moving forward, and we're seeing that in a lot of the data. So those are 2 trends just to be aware of. This next slide gets into talking about stalled out storms. Is your community ready for 25 inches of rain? We can't really stop these storms from happening, but we can get out ahead of them and prepare our communities. I have 10-year-old twins and a 7-year-old. They love going out and picking up trash. They just think it's a fun thing. But like cleaning out storm drains, to them that's a game. I mean, so I was like, wait, you could walk your neighborhood with kids and just say, hey, we're going to look for cluttered storm drains with like leaves and branches and stuff like that. You can get out ahead of the storm and do some things to really help your drainage and help if you do get a heavy rainfall event. These next slides will get into wind. There's something called Fortified. This is a standard that is related with IBHS, the Institute for Business and Home Safety. And this is really interesting. It's a program called Fortified where they're just building better houses. And it's really taken off in South Alabama. These next slides will talk a little bit about it. And actually, I'm sorry, in that last slide, it showed some roofs. From Hurricane Sally, Alabama has far more fortified houses than any state. And these are just built better. It's a better nail pattern. There's an outside inspector that verifies how things are built. But things are sealed, they're fastened. It's a much better built roof. They have 30,000 fortified roofs now in South Alabama. When Hurricane Sally came in as a Cat 2, around 93 to 94% of the buildings sustained no wind damage on those fortified roofs. So it really is a good return on investment, and it can really save you from having damage to your business or your home. That's a picture just showing non-fortified roofs with tarps, and the fortified roofs did really well. You can just do a web search for that and see that. These next slides talk a little bit about the fortified program. We can just go through that. So they have more than 16,000 fortified properties were put to the test. This is from Hurricane Sally. And I'll just read through the sentence in the middle. It said, IBHS conducted field assessments across coastal Alabama to better understand building performance, including dozens of fortified properties. To date, indications are that more than 90% of the thousands of fortified buildings had zero to minor cosmetic damage. As a wind standard, fortified performed to its design. So it's holding up really well when it's tested by hurricanes, which is pretty cool. This might be a map. This talks about how fortified works. Again, it's related with a nonprofit called Smart Home America that's really trying to get out and build better. In some states, there are grants to help you pay for this cost on your house, but it's really nailed down better. It's sealed up. They're sealing the roof deck. If you do lose a shingle, it's sealed underneath so you don't get water damage from above. and then it's really latched in. So it's just a better built roof. You can do a web search and learn more about that. This is a map, I believe, that shows the U.S. This was last year. Alabama had 12,000 fortified houses. Now it's up to like 30,000. It's not as common in places like Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Texas. But again, it can be a good return on investment. It's something to look into. But again, these are ways that we can get out and be proactive. We often talk about getting batteries, getting water, things like that. But your roof can be a major expense and a major danger to your life if your roof fails in a big hurricane. I think these are, let's see, so how to follow me this hurricane season. I'm on social media a lot. I do a weekly podcast. It's like a radio show on disasters and resiliency. We learn a lot on there, not just hurricanes and floods. We've been covering wildfires, ice storms, all kinds of things. There's always lessons learned there, and it's something that you can just listen to in your car when you drive around. It's called the Geotrack Podcast. Last week we had episode 32, and we're just learning a lot. It's a weekly podcast that launches every Monday. And there are some other things here we're going to look at in these next slides. So you can follow me on CNC Catastrophe and National Claims. Some of y'all are used to seeing me on social media with my funny hat. You might not recognize me up here without it. But I like to really, the big thing is I like to do no height weather forecasting. I often say, sometimes weather is held hostage is at the end of the news broadcast so that, because I know people are interested in that. If I view this as a no-threat storm, I'll just straight up, turn off the social media, turn off the TV. People have enough to worry about. I don't make money through advertising, so it doesn't matter to me if I get 1 click or 1 million clicks. My main thing is if there is something to be worried about, I'll talk about that. And I'm going to show you here before we finish. I launched a hazard. This is called Hazard Area Likeliness Map, and I'll produce 2 of these a day if there's a hurricane in the Gulf. And basically what I've done there is it's a stoplight. And the top of the stoplight is wind, the middle is rain, and the bottom is surge. And those dots are just showing you how likely you are to cross different thresholds. So the wind on that map is hurricane force winds. The rain is 12 inches of rain. The surge is 9 feet of surge. So how likely are you to exceed those thresholds? And you can see, I think it's great that the Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center, they get into watches and warnings, but a lot of people want to know, okay, what's the likeliness that I'm going to have hurricane force winds or a big flood? And so those little dots, you can follow through time. And this was, we very accurately forecasted this last year with Hurricane Ida. You can see the stoplight just east of New Orleans. We were saying it's possible you'll get hurricane force winds. It's possible you'll get 12 inches of rain, but it's probable you're going to get a 9-foot storm surge or above. But you can see this one in central Louisiana, also possible for hurricane force winds, possible for 12 inches of rain, but it's unlikely that you'd see 9-foot surge. So this is really localized and customized, and we did very well with these forecasts last year. So that's something that we can also do for a business or for a community or for someone's house. We can do the whole seasonal forecast for your location. We can actually look at a specific storm and forecast that, twice a day. That's where we're moving with our flood and elevation mapping, that we could tell you, hey, the chance that your business is going to flood just went from possible to probable, or probable to likely, and then maybe tie some action items to that. So it's all about getting out ahead and staying informed. I think that's pretty much everything I have. That's my contact info. You can shoot me a message. You can follow on social media. Again, I'm just over in Galveston. I'm not that far away. And it's just, I love these types of events where communities are getting together. They're talking about their storm preparedness. Again, we can't stop the storms, but there's a lot we can do to get out ahead of it. Something I love about living in the Upper Texas coast, community comes together, and people support people and share information and are there as neighbors and as community. So that's why I love living here. And I actually, love to help people out during storm season. So shoot me a message anytime and I'll do my best I can to help you make informed decisions. Thank you so much for your attention today. It was a great turn. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you, Dr. Needham, for this great presentation. We'll be better prepared this season. Can't wait till it's over. Wow, we have learned a lot today to get prepared for this season. Thanks again to all our speakers and sponsors. They are all listed in your program.